this thing. We're going to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I know it is to you, and in some ways to us, both for common but also different reasons. And I mean, you're a dad of three young men at this point. They've launched out, and in that space, like you've got a big stake in next generation of manhood, what that looks like. How that gets discussed, how that gets talked about, how our culture assesses it, how our culture goes about it, all those kind of things. I've been working with a ministry called Better Man for the last couple of years, and I've been doing writing curriculum for them and doing speaking for them and doing some video teaching. Betterman.com you can go to, and there's a lot there. And I think it's now, I think, the largest men's ministry in the country, which is exciting. We're glad. It's all about trying to define a biblical framework of manhood. And we want to talk about manhood. This it sort of uses a base for talking about it a little bit in the state of manhood. A study that came out, a little paper that was released by the organization Better Man in conjunction with a Gospel Family Ministries, and that's kind of rooted. They're both kind of rooted down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Jonathan Williams was one of the authors on the study. He teaches at Southwestern. Chris Harper, who's the executive director of Better Man. David Chase also works there with him. And then Malex Fuget, who is a researcher working with Jonathan Williams. So these two entities, Better Man and Gospel Family Ministries, partnered together, came out with a 2024 State of Manhood paper that sort of gives a brief glimpse into what's the state of manhood as it relates to a man's faith, as it relates to his family, as it relates to his work. But so that's where my interest comes in, because I tend to speak a good amount to men and teach men. And yours comes in from discipling men and being a pastor to men, but also in a more intimate way, you're a parent to men. I happen to be a parent to girls, so I got an interest in who these ladies are going to marry, you know?
A lot of people are worried about or concerned about what manhood is, how it's defined. Culture isn't giving us any helpful clues. Maybe talk about that a little bit, about, why is there such a need for definition and explanation and a way of understanding that's just not only opinion, but it's rooted in something a little bit longer or historical or a little bit deeper than just how we feel.
Yeah, that's great. I think when we think about that, so we're in like this bigger intellectual crisis that we never imagined. I mean, I think that
I have one every morning.
You have an existential crisis?
Intellectual crisis.
Well, I think if we went back in history, even 100 years, and we said to people, there'll come a day when people don't really know what a man is and they don't know what a woman is. They would have looked at you like you had 9 heads. They would have been like, what are you talking about? Like, that is, in some ways, the most fundamental material components in reality we know of. In other words, it's literally the propagation of the species depends upon maleness and femaleness, man and woman. So what would you mean? How could we deconstruct anything more basic to the human civilization than what a man is and what a woman is? And yet, lo and behold, we figured out how to do it. Right. And we figured out how to do it because we actually didn't stop with the insanity of postmodernity. Let me explain something about that. I remember years ago hearing somebody talk. First, I just was learning, and I think I was in college maybe at the time, and I just began hearing a little bit about postmodernism and stuff like this. And I heard somebody talk about how there were people who would, like see like a car, for example, and they would say something like, well, that might be a car for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a car for me, and like I have my truth. And I thought, that's insane. Like everybody knows intuitively when you see a car that it's a car. And if you want to call it an aardvark, or you want to call it an antelope, or you want to call it a box of crayons, it's not that. It's a car. So you can't just make something it's not. And I thought that's literally insane. it has to be like an intellectual experiment. There's no way that can actually gain a footing in a world that has any sense of functionality. Well, it has. And it's happened now with something even more basic than a car. Cars don't propagate species. It's happened with a man and a woman. And it's happened because in postmodernity, you get to question everything, make it subjective to your own impressions. You then want to express yourself in a particular way. And now your expression has to be prized. And so as all that postmodernism, self-expression have all mapped on each other, and as you have had things that in that have come to light within broader culture, manhood has taken on both a reinterpretation on the one hand, but then it's also taken on a kind of vilification on the other. So you have this reinterpretation of what is a man, and then you have a vilification of any historic cultural identity of what manhood is, because we're living in a culture that is not just egalitarian in a healthy way. There's a healthy egalitarianism, a healthy kind of the women's voting movement, and the idea of
suffrage,
being able to have voices from varied perspectives, the idea of human dignity and the image of God and equal worth and these types of things. But what's happened out of that is this conflation and confusion that's taken place between ontology and functionality, between what something is and what something does. And as a result now, we're struggling. We don't want any difference, even as it relates to ontology in many ways. So that all has come together to sort of deconstruct what's male and female. And so the interpretation is shifted. And then men have historically had positions of power. Men have historically had positions of authority. Men are physically more dominant in terms of just their physical anatomical structure. And so as a result, the power structures, both very physically and in terms of resources in the world, have largely been male dominated. So as a result, now the backlash through the deconstruction is the vilification of any semblance of not just male authority, but even the idea and freedom to just say it's okay to be whatever a man is. Now, one other piece. With that comes education. And education now has risen up and is clouding the language structures so that now sex and gender are getting divided. Now, what you are and how you see yourself are getting separated. And both have to be, because we're individuals and individualistic, both have to be valued for what they are. So sex might be okay for your blood test, but gender is what's concerning to us and of issue for us as it relates to how you function in society and culture building and culture making. And as long as you exist in a world now where interpretation is fluid of what counts for gender and culture building, culture making, and you can vilify any traditional constructs of whatever manhood means, well, then manhood's going to be sacrificed. The education comes in that now we have young people growing up and they're uncertain what it is to be a man. And that's not...
Because it would be vilifying, or we would be vilified to say anything objective about it.
Yes, and to encourage it, you know. Mm-hmm. And so that's why, I mean, like, you know, Jordan Peterson has taken a lot of this on in some ways. There's others besides Peterson that have as well. And the problem is also that the moment there's like these stereotypes that get created, and the stereotypes are not particularly helpful, and yet there's another layer, and that is that while the stereotypes are not helpful, that doesn't mean that generalizations aren't. In other words, there are things that make a man different from a woman. There are things that make a woman different from a man. And those things are general to women and general to men. That doesn't mean that we can micro the stereotypes of all different things, which ironically, and this is the irony of it all, is the same movement that wants individual expression and doesn't want stereotyping when it comes to the genders, is the same movement that gives birth to LGBTQ dynamics, where effeminate males project themselves in utterly stereotypical female fashion, almost as caricatures of extreme female fashion. And this is true
Oftentimes they're better at it than
and this is true with the drag.
others.
This is true with drag queen things and so forth. So the idea, it's amazing to me that at the one hand, it's do away with stereotypes. Everything is equal. On the other hand, it's buy in and completely expose and give credence to stereotypes, because that's what we want to do. So it's a very confused day of whether you want the stereotypes, you don't want the stereotypes, or you want to shatter all stereotypes while you are fulfilling the stereotype.
Wow. People will have to slow that down, Bryan. Well, I remember my wife telling me one time when we saw like a drag queen on a show, a TV show, and she's like, she's a more beautiful woman than I am. She dresses better than I do as a woman. And but it's to your point that they embrace the stereotype of the opposite, even though they're rejecting stereotypes of their biological gender.
Yeah. So and I think there's something key with that, and this is there's gold in the mess there. And here's the gold. The gold is implicitly they know that a woman's different from a man and a man's different from a woman. Implicitly they know that there's a place that they work themselves out on the spectrum too, implicitly, and they can't help that. And the reason they can't help it is because they're never able to get away from the binary. The binary is embedded in nature. And as a result, nature is recalcitrant. Nature is stubborn that way. You can't get away from it. So, as a result, that's not all the reason why, by the way, that manhood's in crisis. Manhood is, the first point that needs to be made is manhood is in crisis because we're at this intellectual and cultural moment where there's a lack of liberating to be able to just talk about manhood as a wonderful, amazing, God-given thing.
Well, let me offer you an idea of why I think it is a problem today and why today is different than previous generations. And I want to get your reaction to it. In a relay race, the most important part is the handoff of the baton. And if that doesn't happen, it slows that team down so much that they can't recover typically in the race. I think that's a good analogy for some things that happened, let's call it between the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where manhood was assumed in a lot of ways. We assumed what manhood was. We didn't hand off what manhood was. And as a result, the baton got dropped. And we're trying to scramble to figure it out. And we're reaping the results of that. What do you think?
I think it's true. I think there's actually a really practical explanation. It's not wholesale. There's cultural, there's ideological factors as well. But I think there's actually a cultural piece, and that is as divorce rates rose, and single-parent families begin to emerge after the Greatest Generation out of the 60s and then 70s, and you have more pregnancy out of wedlock and these kinds of things, you have a kind of not just deconstruction of the nuclear family, but a reorganization of the nuclear family. And you can only, the thing about a race is you can only pass the baton if you're actually in the race. You only pass the baton if you're present. And I think that plays into some of it. And I think actually there's been a lot of studies that have been done, particularly even as it relates specifically, it's not exclusive, but specifically to African-American households and some of the crisis of single parents, who I would affirm in the sense, just say that single moms, if you don't have sympathy, empathy, and compassion and respect for single moms, you're not paying very good attention, because single moms have stood in the gap for a lot of schleppy males that have really blown it in a lot of ways, and some single dads too. But it's important to note that a lot of men vacated their responsibility, and a lot of men became sperm donors and not dads. And that part was what Promise Keepers was trying to regain, was some of that. But the challenge on some of those fronts, and this is an important thing to note from the church's side of things. Promise Keepers wasn't a bad thing, and Promise Keepers now is starting to, people look back and it gets vilified for whatever, stereotypical manhood or all these pieces. Or other things, that maybe it didn't do perfectly. So it's not to say all the philosophy was great with it. But the one thing that Promise Keepers did not do, it was kind of akin to like what the Billy Graham Crusade did not do. In the Billy Graham Crusade, many people came to Christ. It was wonderful. Billy Graham was one of the great servants of the 20th century. Like it's amazing. But the Graham Crusade filled a role, and that role was not a discipleship role. That role was a catalytic role for the sake of the gospel. Promise Keepers was a catalytic dynamic. It was event-oriented, gather, rally with men, connect. And it had an effect of bringing awareness. But manhood is taught and caught. And you have to have a kind of discipleship movement to be able to map on to men to be able to pass that baton effectively. And I think that both the church growth movement that saw church largely as an event, the Graham Crusades that saw evangelism as an event, Promise Keepers did kind of see the invoking of men to be men as a call, a sort of crusade of sorts, an event. I think one of the things that we've seen is that doesn't really work in terms of the bestowal of manhood. I think that's important to know.
So let's look at some of the stats. This paper proclaimed the state of manhood. There were some things that came out of this that were a little bit unsettling. And it first starts with how men have kind of exodused from the church.
Yeah.
And it talks about this era of the de-churched. Nearly 40 million people who formerly attended worship, religious services no longer attend. And for the first time since modern tracking and reporting, more adults in the United States don't attend church than attend church. And as I read throughout the paper, the lion's share majority of that 40 million people are men that have left. It's disproportionate as well, because there's a lot more women involved in the church than men.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's true. I mean, that right below that is this amazing stat I marvel at, and that is, as a student of history, I look at that and I'm like, man, the First Great Awakening was amazing. Second Great Awakening was amazing. For those who may not be familiar, First Great Awakening was a largely Puritan revival back in the early portion of the 18th century. And then you had, toward the end of the 18th century, 1790 to about 1840 or so, you had this Second Great Awakening. And that was sort of on the frontiers of revivalism and so forth. And Charles Finney and the Methodist preachers who would ride circuit riding preachers and all kinds of revival meetings out in the country and all that kind of stuff. So you had this amazing thing going on. And then you had the Billy Graham Crusades. And I remember as a kid watching, and CBS, ABC, NBC, they're having
all the major networks.
Yeah, they have them on. It's unbelievable. The stat is that of all the people who came to faith, became Christians, professed faith during the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and the Graham Crusades, if you add them all up, and then you look at the number of people that in the last 30 years have left the church, there's more that have left, 25 years, there's more that have left the church than came to faith in all three of those, which is mind-blowing.
That's a lot.
To me. Now,
that's a lot.
Ultimately, that's a cultural shift of huge proportions that obviously has to do with a lot more than that has to do with the whole cultural subtext that we were talking about the way we conceive of church, the way we conceive of expressing ourselves, the way that we conceive of power structures working, and all kinds of things that play into that. Now, interesting you bring out that it seems like a majority of those are men. And perhaps that has to do with another stat that's shows up about, what is it that, like, I think less than 10% of all churches in the Western world have a functional, like, regular men's ministry.
Yeah.
And like 80% of churches in the Western world have a functional women's ministry. And so this isn't to say that it all hinges upon that, but it is to say this: there's some correlation, number one. And it is to say, too, what I said earlier, that the iterative crusade-like approach is different than local church discipleship. And when we don't have local church discipleship, you're not available to pass the baton. And it needs to be passed. And so that part, and that's important even as it relates to fatherlessness, because where do you find aunts and uncles and grandparents that are out, and cousins and so forth, that are not biological to you? The extended family that can pour in if you never had a father in your life, a dad in your life, a male figure in your life that could give you a vision of robust faith. Well, where you get it from the church, right? And you're not going to get it from a weekend event.
Yeah, life today, as an American, you mentioned the Western world, is so cellular, it's so granular, it's so separated from others, yet we're more connected than we ever have been. And it's a paradox, because we have all the capabilities for connecting with one another, yet we don't do it.
So this is interesting question. It begs a question. I mean, I see that stat that I mentioned a moment ago, and it's in the state of manhood here, and it makes me wonder why. Why is it that churches have not, in the last number of years, had functional men's ministries? Why is it that these women's ministries outnumber them? And it's an interesting question.
Have you thought of some possible solution?
I think part of it. I think part of it is that much. First of all, women tend to be better at community, and that's going to, somebody might hear that and go, "Well, that's stereotypical." No, it's a generalization that's true. They tend to be. It doesn't mean that men aren't, but it does mean that I think that especially, I think other cultures are different, but especially in the Western world, meaning the largely Anglo-dominated world, and that is governed by the historic intellectual tradition of Western European thought, is that independence is valued and prized. Our whole country is based upon a kind of independent pioneer spirit. It's based upon being a land of opportunity. It's based upon being a place of innovation. And all of those have something in common. They're largely granular and molecular. They're not largely connected to other things. They can be, and it's great when they are, but largely they're not. Like, land was staked by, I remember the movie Far and Away, like people ran and staked land individually for themselves. They built their own subsistence farms. Like before industrialization, it was all rooted in that. Capitalism is good, but it's rooted in the idea of what you are able to do and what you bring as a contributor to a market economy. It's so individualistic. And so I think that one of the challenges is individualism is like, it's like the blood in our veins. And so it's hard to get men out of that in ways that it's not women.
I'm going to blame it on the cleavers. Leave it to Beaver,
okay.
Ward and June.
You're going to blame it on Ward and June?
Well, I think a lot of the examples that were championed throughout the TV age weren't very good examples. I would say Ward and June were wholesome, okay? But the only thing I ever learned from Ward was that he got stern with Beaver and that he left for work. I didn't ever see him, like sharing his struggles with other men. Okay. I didn't ever, see that type of community modeled. Now, I think there is a lot of that happening today in media, but it's almost like we missed our opportunity to have a Christian ethic of having a vulnerable man championed. Instead, we went with either Ward Cleaver or the Marlboro Man.
Yeah.
And we use those as, well, you know, the man is the hard worker who goes off to work and supplies for his family, or he's the Marlboro Man, independent, you know, tough, never
Yes.
talks about his feelings. And as a result, we sterilized men
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
being able to actually be what we would define, what I think the Bible defines as a man.
I
or a
agree
man.
with you. And I think there have been men's ministry movements along the way that have tried to mitigate it. You know, I think of the with Better Man, the guy that kind of helped start that and found that, and that it's sort of a next generation from Robert Lewis with Men's Fraternity. He tried to do that, and it was effective. He wrote a Modern Day Night about bestowing manhood on your son and those kinds of things. And I think that was helpful, and I think that was effective in some ways. I just think that even as we talk today, it's an uphill battle. Like you're going against the grain when Dumas wrote the book Jesus and John Wayne. Jesus and John Wayne. When she wrote that, that critique of manhood and the toxic masculinity of evangelicalism and so forth, that's not going against a grain. She's going along with the grain of the broader structure. She's joining a kind of cultural deconstruction that comes on. So to then, in the face of that, say, no, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to reconstruct against those winds a vision of manhood is hard work.
Let me give you a thought about that.
Yeah.
I think with you working with Better Man, others investing in that, I don't want us to underestimate the impact that it can have. It is an uphill battle, but as we plant the seeds of what we believe God's word has to say, I don't think we really can contain the results.
Yeah.
I think there is a great opportunity here. There's a great opportunity for people listening to not be depressed about the state of manhood, but to say, oh, actually, there are some good ministries painting and planting a vision forward that we can have hope in. I just did a Better Man group last year for several months. We went through the initial, I forgot what the first one's called. It's the core, right?
Better Man Core.
And
Better Man Core.
And then there's other ones that are iterative.
For Better Man Defined, they're called.
And anybody here listening can download those, be a group leader, and go through them with other people, plant those seeds. But let's...
And it's interesting to kind of spring from that because, you know, when people hear that, okay, you're talking about manhood and stuff, so as you talk around the edges of it, what would you actually say it is? And so I'm going to go ahead and take the Better Man kind of definition of it because I think the 4 pillars of it are helpful. And so the idea is that a man is one who courageously follows God's word. And if somebody would go, well, that's a man. Well, yes, because he was designed by God. And so he needs his instructions from his designer. He is one who loves and protects God's woman. Now, someone may look and go, well, isn't that a superiority complex? No, it's not. It's a responsibility complex. It's taking seriously your role. He excels at God's work. He takes seriously what it is that God puts in front of them, and he happens to it in a way that is filled with diligence and filled with faithfulness. And then he betters God's world. He sees himself out. Now, what I want people to see is there's a common thread that goes through all 4 of those. And what goes through all 4 of those is selflessness. Like, you can't courageously follow, you can't love and protect, you can't give yourself to some job, and you can't look at the world as a place where you expend yourself and be selfish. So the irony in all of it is that the traditional, classical, conceptual, right definition of manhood at its core is rooted in self-sacrifice and selflessness. And so we're here fighting uphill to be selfless. And that's because we live in a completely self-expressive, selfish world. It's almost otherworldly to our present culture to have a definition of manhood that runs the exact opposite. And yet it's the key thing to rescue people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think the Christianity I grew up in really articulated that very well. They articulated that a man needed to be in control. Now, I didn't say controlling, but they had to have this idea that they were in control of their destiny, in control of
kind
what
of Invictus kind of thing.
And I think that is an appropriate criticism of culture today of what we were.
Oh yeah, the self-made man is mythological in that way, and it makes for a bad leader. I to that end, I wanted to get your response to Piper. He has in the paper, he has a definition that they quote John Piper defining spiritual leadership. And I think the key is spiritual leadership, but a man is called to this. And so I was curious what your thought was about this definition. He says that a spiritual leadership is knowing where God wants people to be and taking the initiative to use God's methods to get them there in reliance on God's power. So knowing where God wants people to be and taking the initiative to use God's methods to get them there in reliance on God's power.
Well, that would say that every Christian man should be a kept man. A kept man is kind of a negative term sometimes, like his wife has control over him. But what I'm meaning by that is that a Christian man is a kept man in that they're kept in their captivation, that God is in control, leading them, empowering them, guiding them, directing them, readjusting their thoughts about the world that are malformed. I would say Piper uses some specific terms in there that I really like quite a bit. Read that definition again.
So he says,
one in
knowing
there
where God wants people to be and taking the initiative to use God's methods to get them there in reliance on God's power. I read that and I'm like, man, what stands out to me immediately is that it's not a self-controlled man as much as it's a God-controlled man, and meaning that if there's a humility, there's a saying, my methods aren't the best, God's methods are the best. There's I can't do it in my own power, so I'm going to rely on God's power. So it does say he takes the initiative. I love that. The idea is I'm going to say,
you can't take that sans God.
I was listening to
without God,
a worship leader, and he was leading some people in a song. And it was good. It was good. He was leading people in a song, and he made the statement. He said, "Can we just get to the place in our lives where we just say, your way, God's better. Your way is better." And I've thought, it's so simple, but I've thought a lot about that. And I've thought, that is such a core issue in almost all of our lives, is just being able to lay down our cards and say, your way is just better than ours. And we'll listen, and we'll follow the script, and we'll abide by the principles, and we'll rely on you, and we'll seek wisdom outside ourselves, and we won't be independent. So manhood then becomes true manhood becomes the antithesis of the self-made man. It's actually the one who can't make himself.
Well,
knows it.
I think takes initiative also is speaking to the other, I don't know what the percentage is, 50, 60, 70% of manhood that is passive.
Yeah.
And that's part of Robert Lewis's definition of manhood used to be he rejects passivity, and that was the first kind of step. And we have this whole thing that you've probably heard of the phrase sheep not or lions not sheep.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's
sheeple.
I think that whole movement is not unfounded because there's so many passive men.
Mm-hmm.
But when you do take initiative, what you were talking about is why and how you take initiative, as well as where do you take it.
Yeah. So in that way, there's this part where you bring that together and you go, well, I'm going to live like a lion because I am a sheep. That's the truth. I mean, I'm following the Lord as his sheep, which gives me then the security to live like a lion. So
I don't want to be a lion,
but if you
because
see
he's
yourself,
the shepherd.
Yeah, if you see yourself,
He's going to strike you
yeah,
down.
well, there's a part of that though there's a part of that movement though that sees this. There's a little Invictus in it.
Oh.
There's a little bit of I'm the man. I'll take hold of it. I'll do. So there is a health to a strong initiative, but that initiative has to be measured. That I'm initiating God's methods. I'm doing it in reliance upon Him. So what I've watched. Is I've seen this call to manhood that is vacated of being a sheep. And then I've seen this other side where I've seen a bunch of passive abdicating husbands who think they're not causing any problems and are actually sowing hell on their families because their passivity is leaving a leadership vacuum where now their wife is thrust into decision-making and processing independent of them usually, or over against them. And bearing responsibilities like a single mom in a home with a man that should be available, and she's functioning the way she shouldn't have to.
But
function.
video games are a job.
Yeah, it's a pretty. I will say one of the crises in men though is that, and the state of manhood hits this, and it's that men are lonely. And I think that that's part of what's happened as they've extricated themselves from church. It's sort of a natural part of that, right? That men need community, and the rise in technology, COVID, the rise in gaming, the isolation, the ability to work from home, everything at your fingertips, a Wall-E kind of world, that has not helped at all. In fact, there's a stat that they give in the paper that says a significant number of men reported feelings of loneliness and isolation. Nearly 1/3 of the surveyed men revealed a, quote, lack of genuine male godly friendships, which resulted in feelings of despair and loneliness that directly impacted their spiritual health. I think that idea, I see that with men. Men in particular are lonely, and our egos keep us from reaching out sometimes. But I think a part of manhood genuinely is being able to lose that sense of self-sufficiency, be able to lean in and not give into the cultural pieces that press us toward ultimately toward isolating.
Let me bring in another stat that was right below that. The top struggle that men have is lust. They confess these emotional burdens. They talk about them here. But when you think about lust, lust is really, and when you succumb to it, it's really just actually a symptom of what a deeper problem is.
Yes.
And when you have a lot of loneliness going on, lust is actually the number one thing at the door. I would say anger would be,
in some ways, anger is often a precursor to lust.
That's true.
A lot of men, use that as an outlet for their own pent-up emotions and frustrations. I mean, I think that's the case. It goes in. So they have to talk about a man in his faith, a man in his family, and they talk about a man in his work. And there's this piece with a man in his work. It says this: how are non-working men between 25 and 54 spending their time? Men that aren't working. On average, nearly 7 hours each day, each weekday are dedicated to leisure time, relaxing, playing games, and watching TV. And they talk about, how many have dropped. 7.2 million men have dropped out of the workforce lately. The workforce participation is down 8% and so forth. You were joking earlier about games and playing games and stuff like that. Here's something that I think is a real big issue that is not talked about nearly enough. Our society, part of what makes manhood a challenge is that our society is incredibly trivial. Our society we have huge dollars that are rooted in entertainment. Billions and billions of dollars. The technological accessibility. I think with the technological accessibility also comes a plethora of, and a glut of bad, difficult, and dark information that makes it feel like sometimes we have to anesthetize ourselves. So, I mean, what person probably watching this doesn't, whether it's a scroll through Instagram, browse through YouTube shorts, flip around on Facebook and all these kind of things, right? And sometimes what person hasn't caught themselves going, oh my gosh, I just did this for the last hour, and we're a people literally who kind of are not just entertaining ourselves to death, but here's what I think of. I think we're not very serious. And I think that's actually a big issue with men. I think men are not serious enough. I think we swung the pendulum way the other direction. I think we saw generations from a Ward Cleaver generation. We're like, these guys are just serious all the time.
I'm going to run from that, reject it.
Yeah. So I'm going to swing the other way. So the 60s come, and then my three favorite sitcoms, right? MASH, Seinfeld, and The Office. And in some ways, they went progressively less serious.
Serious, yeah.
MASH had huge comedic moments, and yet some incredible social commentary, some pretty weighty moments as well, some pretty earthy moments of human compassion and crisis, and comments about war and pacifism and all kinds of things are actually embedded in MASH pretty deeply. Seinfeld was this thing that was like a show about nothing, and yet it was kind of about everything at the same time in some ways. The Office was largely a parodied escape from reality that sort of took this exaggerated, right, extreme, and just took us away into a non-reality. And I look at that and I think I enjoy those shows. Don't get me wrong. It's not some false piety at all. But they're kind of a metaphor in a progressive slide in culture of just becoming more and more and more and more and more trivial. And I think as a result, young men don't feel the weight of their life sometimes. I think they fritter away. Some of them tragically fritter away years accomplishing almost nothing. And I think that is something that should alarm us. It should make us think about how we're crafting the idea that every single moment of your life is a stewarded moment. It really is a stewarded moment. That doesn't mean you've got to be solving the world's problems every minute. You need rest. You need recuperation. You need to be renewed in different ways.
You need to laugh a little.
You do. You do. You need all those things. But we've kind of gone way the other direction with it.
Well, part of that is the state of manhood. If you don't have a man to tell you
that you're needed,
you need to be serious,
and you're needed.
And this is how you could do it
Yeah.
in a healthy way.
Yes.
If you don't have that, it's no wonder why we're in this state. It makes so much sense, and everything now is about anesthetizing the soul, because actually people do feel like they're wasting their lives. We didn't look at suicide statistics, but they're not down.
Yeah.
They're up. And they're happening at lower and lower of an age. as we go forward. So I think there's some meat on the bone to talk about. Okay, you need to fast track that conversation with the young men around you.
Yeah.
You shouldn't wait. You shouldn't be passive about it, because you might have woken up in your 40s, but guess what? They're not going to wake up until their 50s unless you do something now. So don't delay talking to younger men about how God woke you up about being a man. Mm-hmm. And just be transparent, vulnerable, in that I waited too long. I know I'm not you, but you have value, you have worth, you can contribute. There is a vision for your life that can be more than just money, more than just entertainment. And there's reasons for that. There's reasons for the way you feel about life, and you're trying to just cope with everything. I think there's a message for every man listening, because we need to act with some urgency here. Young people are frittering away their lives. Mm-hmm. Comment a little bit on John Piper's book, Don't Waste Your Life. Have you read that?
Yeah.
Or it's been a while,
mm-hmm.
and he addressed that issue.
Yeah.
Quite pointedly.
Yeah. I mean, he has his famous illustration. It's actually an illustration I think he tells in the book, but he preached on it in a famous sermon that he did that was I think it was at a Passion gathering, and he preached the sermon where he told the famous story about the couple he knew in Florida who had retired. It was a Reader's Digest story, I think it was, that he read.
I remember
it. He said that, they had, the story talked about how they had retired early, American dream, 50 years old, and he was playing golf every day, and they would take walks on the beach and collect shells,
seashells.
And so he Piper famously said, "What's going to happen at the judgment when they stand before God?" And he says, "Give an account for how you chose to live your life." And Piper says, "Are they going to look and say, 'Oh, Lord, see my shells?'" And Piper used that famously and brilliantly to point out that we can, in the name of the land of opportunity, in the name of the American dream, we can dream ourselves right out of reality. We can dream ourselves right away from the things that matter the most. Now, I think when we put all this together, what we have to do is think about, if a man is going to take that baton, not just a young man, but any man, and he's going to lead, and he's going to lead in the way that Piper, I think, was a healthy articulation in here. He's going to take the initiative to lay hold of God's methods and rely on God for how he's going to do these things, and in helping people in his life. He's going to take those four pillars that are all, I mentioned, threaded through with selflessness. He's going to step in and lead his family. He's going to lead them in faith, and he's going to lead his friendships and stuff like that. It got me thinking about what would be the barriers to him doing that.
Oh, yeah.
So what would be things that we'd go, man, this is what'll keep a guy from that. And these aren't rocket science, but I had 7 of them that I thought should be mentioned. So I think the first one is, one barrier is that a man is broken, and he has to be able to acknowledge his brokenness. But he's broken, and usually he is broken and pridefully so. So this is a starting point, is until I can say, okay, I've got to see that I have to change, right? So if a man simply says, here's who I am and I won't change, then there is no hope for him. There's no hope outside of change. And so I guess one hope, he can't have the hope. Others can hope for him that God will place him in a circumstance and bend him to the point of almost breaking him so that he will see his need to change. That's the hope you can have for somebody who is just completely unteachable in every way. But I think at bottom, one barrier is a man who is stubborn and prideful and is broken, but in that he retains his pride and he won't change. So, so humility then becomes an essential piece. The second barrier is that there are men who are just not equipped. They're not equipped. There are things that don't come naturally. And that same person who's not equipped is also probably prideful. So that means that not just that he won't change, but that maybe he won't ask. He won't ask. I always remember an illustration I read in a book about there's a book on marriage, and the author talked about how if a wife gets upset at her husband because he doesn't know to bring her flowers and he doesn't know to sort of do those kinds of things, but he's willing to learn, she shouldn't be upset at him. She should be willing to let him learn. In other words, sometimes it seems like he should just do it organically. But a lot of men don't know. They were never taught. And that's a small thing, bringing flowers, but they were never taught to love well. They were never taught to lead well. They were never taught to manage well. They were never taught to think in the long term. They were never taught to lean into community, you know? So like, he's got to, it's okay that you're not equipped. If you're listening, you're watching, it's okay that you don't know. What's not okay is if you don't know and you don't ask.
Yeah, one thing that can happen as a result of those two is some men are innovative, they are teachable, but they think it's by their own their own chutzpah.
Yeah.
And as a result, they may be teachable functionally and practically, but their heart isn't teachable, that they're broken and need a repair. Mm-hmm. They're just advancing and developing and evolving. And if you miss the first one and you're good at the second one, you can become a person that's really good at things, but does not possess humility.
Yeah, so, I work with men.
You work with some people like that.
I work in discipleship and work even one-on-one with men. And in doing that, there is a big distinction that's made between a man who, between those two, I guess is what I'd say, between someone who is broken and pridefully so and won't change. You're stifled. You can't do anything with them. Usually they're there because their wife wants them there or something like that. I also have men who are broken, but they're not equipped. But they're interested. Like they're willing to say, I don't know. Will you help me? Now, the things that I watch them go do, it's awesome. I mean, I watch them. I can think even recently of seeing a guy who just not equipped, but taking some equipping, lays hold of it, and I can watch his wife, and I can see the change. I can see what's happening, and I go, okay, all right, we're making progress here, right? Because he's willing to make progress, but he can only make progress if he laid down the pride and asked, right? Third, a barrier to a man leading his family is he's selfish, meaning that it's not that he doesn't know how. It's that he won't invest. He's selfish. He won't invest. He won't give the time. He'd rather watch the football game than have the conversation. He'd rather, like, my youngest daughter often will ask me, her room is downstairs in our home, down in the basement. And she'll often ask me, Daddy, can you come downstairs in my room and talk? It's kind of our thing. So I go down, I lay on the bed, and we talk. That is not an invitation I want to say no to. Like, why would I want to say no to that? That is an invitation that she is inviting me into her room so that I can hear her heart. I can think in fun ways and creative ways, sometimes sad, sometimes deep ways about her life. Now, that means that I may not be able to watch the game. That means that I may not be able to do something else. I may have to put the book down, what have you. A selfish man goes, I'm watching a game.
Don't you know I worked hard all day?
Yeah, come on. And a leader says, okay, I'll be down. I'm coming. Goes down. And I think that it's not that I hit that home run on that all the time. I don't want to pretend that I do, but I'm conscious of it. I'm aware of the implications of it. And I'm also aware that if I sow selfishness, it's going to be destructive to my family. So I think a barrier is he's selfish. He won't invest. A fourth one is he's confused. He's confused. And what I mean by that is I think he doesn't, he has a hard time ferreting out and working through his priorities in his life. And so he's caught up in things that are just not worth it. Trivial things have sort of gotten a hold of him. Maybe work has gotten a hold of him. He's a workaholic, and he doesn't have work in proper perspective. He doesn't have recreation in proper perspective. He doesn't have other relationships in proper perspective. He doesn't have maybe relationships with the opposite sex even in right perspective. And so he's just confused. So he won't assess the priorities.
What do you think helps a person out of confusion?
Getting equipped. So number 2 helps number 4. I think is one. When I'm confused in my life, good information usually helps me out of confusion pretty well. It's not the only thing. Good relationship does, and so forth. Slowing down does. Thinking about my own motives does. All those things, but oftentimes I just don't have the right information, so I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like a monkey flying a spaceship. I just don't know. I don't know how to do it, man. I don't know where this thing's going, And so that's where I end up just killing myself.
I was just thinking about a monkey flying a spaceship.
I know.
That was pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
You put that thought in my head. But I think one initial way to help people, even if you don't have all the information, is becoming good at asking questions. So as a person that might be a companion to them, and you go out for dinner or whatever, just ask them questions about, I know you're so busy at work. Well, let's say that somebody's a workaholic. Where do you think that goes in life?
Yeah.
What? And start asking the questions.
Help them play the tape forward.
Mm-hmm. And then the other one is to help them start asking their own questions and being okay with, what do you think of this? I'm kind of not frustrated, but things aren't going the way I want. How could I do it differently? I think becoming a good questioner as a companion, but also a questioner of yourself is a way of overcoming confusion. But I think the big thing as a Christian man is, have you really asked God? And I've found that actually a lot of men, when I would ask them the question, have you ever talked to God about that?
Yeah.
It's like a monkey flying a spaceship.
There you go. It is.
You've never seen it before.
That's good. No, I like that.
So,
those questions are really good because it shows you the implications. You get to think about the implications of what you're doing or not doing,
and that motivates you for training. That motivates you for equipping, and it drives it. So I think it's kind of that initiative button. Once you press it, then it automatically leads. You're going to work to find the solution somewhere.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think some good observations there.
What's
I like
number
the
5?
questioning. Number 5 is he's a coward. He's a coward. Nobody wants.
How dare you?
Coward of the county. Kenny Rogers, great. But yeah, he's a coward. And
Took a gamble on that one.
Here's what I mean by that. I saw what you did there.
I know when to hold them. I know when to fold them.
He's a coward. He won't face pain. And I think this is something. And here's what I mean by that. It won't face pain. Men think about this in terms of like, this is where real man language gets lost. A real man is not the guy who takes jujitsu and does UFC. That kind of a thing, it could be, but that kind of a thing is not the artifact, is my point, that makes a real man. Because here's the thing. You can have a real man who will get in the octagon with somebody, but who can't make a hard decision that disappoints his wife. He can get in the octagon with somebody, but he can't tell his kids no. He can get in the octagon with somebody, but he can't disrupt the rhythms of his life and vacate something he enjoys. He can't sacrifice for a greater good. So he's somebody who will not face pain. And sometimes, as a man, you'll make decisions and it's going to leave your kids upset, frustrated. It's not that you're trying to do that. It's that you're making a decision for a good to build a healthy family culture. Almost never happens without disruption and pain. So sometimes I find men that they're just unwilling to weather with a good character, not with harshness and not with forget it, doesn't matter what you say, but with a constancy of spirit to say, okay, I can embrace some discomfort and some pain for the good of everyone here. So I think sometimes being a coward keeps people from it.
Robert Lewis, when he was defining manhood, and I know we've not changed it, but kind of articulated it. But he talks about a real man rejects passivity, leads courageously, and then a concept called expects the greater reward.
Yeah.
So he's willing to defer gratification. He's willing to go through pain because he sees something on the horizon that's worth it. And I would articulate that it's important to do that, as you said, in a way that's good, in a way that's helpful. Yeah. So sometimes
if you lose your chips doing it, that's a problem.
Or you whine and complain.
Yep, complain, get angry, be resentful.
Don't you know I've sacrificed for you?
Manipulate. Yeah, none of that's allowed. But if you can be virtuous and if you can be kind, but you can hold the line, your family will be blessed because of it. Sixth, he's a man has a barrier leading his family because he's alone. He's alone. I don't lead well alone. I don't lead well alone now. That includes my companionship with my wife. I need that. But it also includes the voice of other men. And it includes the prayers of other men. It includes the counsel. It includes the admonishment. It includes the encouragement. It includes sometimes just them being there, just the companionship of other men. So I think what the problem there is, we've kind of taken one each. He won't change. He won't ask. He won't invest. He won't assess his priorities. He won't face pain. Here, he won't reach out. He won't reach out. It's not just asking for help on a specific issue. It's saying, I need you. I need your presence in my life with me.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, that's the height of vulnerability for a man. Because it's one thing for me. It's one thing for me to say, Brad, I need your help doing this thing on my car if I know you know about doing that. There's humility in that, but that's like one level of it. It's different than if I say, Brad, I just need you with me. I just need you with me. I don't want to do it. It
feels different.
I don't want to do it alone.
It felt a little bit odd.
Yeah, it is. I don't want to do it alone. That's like, what are you saying? I know, and you're the worst for it. You're the worst for it going alone. So the final one is that he's shallow. He's shallow. And this gets to what I mentioned earlier about the triviality, is that some guys, they won't feel the weight of their role. They won't feel the weight of it. They resist feeling the gravitas, that people look at them and depend upon them and anchor to them and find some of their own identity tied up with them. But that's true.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so he's broken, prideful, not equipped, selfish, confused, coward, alone, and he is shallow. Those are all negative things, but I would just say, boy, there's he is healed by the gospel, right? He is equipped. He is selfless. He is clear thinking. He is courageous. He is in community. He is deep. Like you can flip those around on the positive side and go pursue those things, you know.
What do you think helps a man that you're working with to not be shallow?
Well, it's a couple of these earlier ones. I mean, there is a part of asking, so you can be equipped.
Mm-hmm.
There is a part of not going it alone. But I think there's also a part, I think a good exercise for every man to do is to get out a piece of paper and to begin to list that if they had, for example, colossal moral and spiritual failure come upon their life, to list every single person they know and how they would be affected in their life by their failure, and to write out specifically how they'd be affected, and to look at that for a while and to think about it. Because I think what happens is we sometimes get into a survival mode and we don't think about the ripple effect of our own lives. And we think of ourselves as sort of like this little pebble that gets thrown into this pond and has a little ripple out. We're not. We're asteroids. We're asteroids that drop into lakes, like with tsunamis. I mean, it's not that way. It's not ripples. Think about the ripple effect. No, it's the tsunami effect. It changes lives forever, for the rest of their existence. Sometimes it pushes people away from God for eternity. Like, so to me, a man has to have the courage to feel the cold, dead weight around his neck of his wife, of his kids, of his mom and dad, of his church, of his friends, of people he hasn't even met yet.
So shallow isn't about how much you know. It's actually about how deeply you're concerned.
Yeah. It's how deeply you feel the weight of who you are in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And a man who doesn't feel the weight of who he is in this world is a weapon. He's a weapon. Not for good. So that's what I'd say. State of manhood summary. I hope you guys watching have enjoyed this, interacting. By the way, the comment sections, things like that. You want to leave a comment, you want to ask a question to us. It'll only fuel us further down the road on this YouTube venture and on this podcast and all that stuff with Life on the Line. So hit us up.
Anything lighthearted, addressed to Bryan or addressed to myself. Yeah. Anything deep and cutting.
Anything deep and cutting for me. Complaints, whines, Brad. We'll go there. All right. Thanks.
All right.
Been a good show.
Yep. Good job.